All right, guys. So here we go with the video notes portion of Reconstruction. We're looking to essentially define Reconstruction, understand why it happened, what it did. We're going to look at the political and economic changes taking place in the wake of the Civil War, understanding the difference between presidential and congressional Reconstruction, and understanding the impact of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln on each of those. So we got to understand, right? First and foremost, what was the country like in the wake of the Civil War? And we got to understand that at the national level, the federal government had greatly increased its power. Understanding that during the Civil War, with the southern states having seceded, the Southern Democrats gone, right? We understand that Republicans were able to get through virtually any legislation that they wanted. The country was just the Union. And so the federal government greatly expanded its power during the Civil War. And in the period following the Civil War, it was clear that this federal government would never again be challenged by secession. The Civil War was of great benefit to the North. Whether we like it or not, we often see that wars are a boon for an economy. There's wartime manufacturing. There's generally widespread popular support of the economic policies that go along with that. Whereas down south, the South was devastated. We understand that most of the Civil War was fought down south. And so there's significant impact of a negative nature down south, while, again, the northern government, the union government, the federal government expands. The banking system is strengthened through the passage of the National Bank Act. There is subsidized construction primarily, as we talked about before, up north of the National Railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad. And so we see essentially kind of two nations emerge. As the southern states begin to re-enter the Union, most of their governments are also Republican. This is in large part a result of the influx of African American voters that we see during the early period of Reconstruction who vote Republican, and in large part due to the disenfranchisement of former Confederates. But the South has to be both literally and figuratively rebuilt during Reconstruction, during this period of Reconstruction. Physically, right, with the war having taken place in the South, right, the farms are destroyed, the slaves, the means of labor are gone, factories and homes are destroyed, the Confederate money, Confederate bonds is worthless. So the South is kind of in shambles in the wake of the Civil War. For the slaves, right, a lot of them begin to kind of test their new freedoms. There's familial reunification. A lot of them move to cities in the South, or they move up north. There is the establishment of Black educational services and institutions, HBCUs. The foundation of African American churches, one of the few institutions that's fully controlled by Blacks, and it becomes central to African American life in the South. A lot of the facts, of this, what's taking place is that the former slaves have no skills, no education, and they're living in persistent racism. So we see this mass migration period, one of the first periods of great migration of African Americans moving from the South to the North. Those who stay in the South, as we said, do begin to establish a little bit of a different culture down South. We talked about the churches. We talked about the HBCUs. Right here in North Carolina, there's a great tradition of HBCUs. We have North Carolina Central. We have Shaw. We have North Carolina A&T. We talked about A&T with the Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins a couple weeks ago. So there is a formation of a different culture for the former slaves in the South. But again, there's kind of a mass exodus at the same time. and life after slavery is markedly different, especially in the very early periods. But from an economic perspective, as opposed to those cultural changes, there's unfortunately very little that changes. You know, if we've heard this notion of the freed slaves being promised 40 acres and a mule, there was actually no mention of a mule, but the expression comes from William Tecumseh Sherman, who had promised 40 acres to all of the freed blacks throughout the South. Um, that doesn't turn out to be the case. Most of the land goes back to the former plantation owners and the slave holders, and the owners seek, in large part successfully, a return to a cash crop system similar to that used prior to the Civil War. Um, and the North, once again, is not absent some blame here. They are more than willing to go along with it. Why? Because the northern manufacturing industries, textiles in particular, thrive on cheap labor, just as they had in the days of slavery. So, what we witness in the Southern economy when we talk about very little change, we see a lot of former slaves return back to that same land, those same plantation, those same slaveholders, where they work as day laborers. Again, some of them refuse. There's a greater influx into southern cities. There's a greater influx of this first great migration period uh, heading back north. Um, but the southern economy we're going to see has ultimately kind of very little changing about it. When we talk about those day laborers, okay, they are generally they're no longer slaves, but they're generally considered one of two types of laborers, either sharecroppers or tenant farmers. Okay, and both of them are equally as destructive in terms of um, a lack of opportunity for the blacks, the African Americans, the former slaves, to build wealth. So sharecroppers, or the sharecropping system, is when the landowner, the plantation owners, right, the former slaveholders, provides a worker, a former slave, with some land, some tools, some seeds, and the worker returns a portion of that crop to the landowner, and the landowner sets the price for that crop. So once again, the controller of the capital here are the same people that controlled the capital prior to the Civil War, and that's the landowners. Tenant farmers are, or tenant farming is a system where these former slaves rent land from the landowner for a fee, and then they keep all of their harvest. Regardless, the means of production, the capital, still belongs to those same people to whom the capital belonged prior to the Civil War. Um, they are the workers, the former slaves, are tied to that same land. And so we see in Reconstruction generally a failure. There are a number of attempts to restrict the former slave vote, but early on, there's enough African American participation to vote Republican. And for a brief and shining moment, there's a glimpse of equality for Black Americans. Um, these Republicans are looking to, again, both literally and figuratively reconstruct the South from especially an economic, but also a social perspective. However, all of this leads to a white supremacist based backlash. And this Republican rule is short. We're going to witness a return of Democratic rule in the South, and we are going to usher in the Jim Crow era through the institution of black codes. Now, I've given you a link here on what we mean by black codes. If you want to check this out, I would highly suggest you pause this and read about these black codes, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it in a second, okay? But there's kind of a brief contextual overview of what we're talking about with Reconstruction. Let's dive in a little bit deeper now, especially after you read that article. So One of the most important aspects to how this reconstructive era gets thrown off the rails is through the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Um, Lincoln is clearly not a popular figure in the South. His election, after all, was the final straw that caused South Carolina to secede in 1860. And you might think that there was kind of support or maybe the nipping in the bud of kind of negativity towards the South because of this, but it actually has a very negative impact. Lincoln, we understand, really wanted more than anything the reunification of the nation. Okay, that was really his goal all throughout the Civil War. Anyway, remember he didn't really uh, declare anything about the Emancipation Proclamation until he had enough military victories, and he also thought that the Emancipation Proclamation was the smart political play in terms of kind of changing the tide of the war. Everything else, he was about saving the Union. And so even in the early days, the earliest days of Reconstruction, right? Um, Lincoln's plan was going to be relatively lenient on the seceding states to allow them back into the Union. Um, his assassination is ultimately going to shift the Reconstruction era from what we'll call presidential Reconstruction into congressional Reconstruction, okay, which is controlled more by the quote unquote radical Republicans. And we might take exception with that characterization, as we'll talk about. But it's going to shift the tides, and Reconstruction will look different. Um, that ultimately will find itself aborted as well, however. Um, but generally, Lincoln was going to be lenient in favor of reunification. He had a what we call a 10% plan, where all that had to happen for the former seceding states, the Confederate States of America, to be recognized back into the Union was just 10% of each state's citizens uh, had to swear allegiance to the United States. The radical Republicans, as it were, okay, and again, we'll talk more about that term, they wanted to punish the South. Some felt. I don't know if that's even a fair characterization. Um, but they really just wanted to provide full citizenship and suffrage to African Americans, and they wanted to up the ante from 10% to 50% of the state's citizens declaring allegiance to the Union. So the radical Republicans passed the Wade Davis bill that does just that, but Lincoln actually vetoes it before his assassination, thinking that if not too harsh, would be perceived as too harsh. Again, he wants to placate whomever he needs uh, to force a peaceful reconciliation, right, for saving the Union. A lot of the Southerners really resent the Northerners, especially those that they call the radicals, right? They think that the Northerners are trying to take advantage of a vulnerable South. Um, they call those Southerners who join in with the Republican Party scallywags. They call those Republicans that move down south carpetbaggers. Now, some of those people were probably trying to take advantage of a vulnerable South, and many of them were just legitimately trying to start businesses. They see that there's economic opportunity in this Reconstruction era. But with Lincoln absent, Andrew Johnson, who takes over, virtually allows the southern states to pass what we call black codes, okay, which further restricts the rights of blacks. Essentially, what we're going to see is that we take southern laws that had been in place about slaves and simply replaces the word slaves with African Americans or former slaves or freedmen. And Republican governments try to fight against the black codes by passing a series of laws against this type of segregation, but they're often ignored. And again, in the wake of Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson kind of just lets this go. So Johnson is he wants the southern states back in. His plan under presidential, Reconstruction is that they withdraw their former claims of secession. They swear allegiance to the USA. The federal government annuls their Confederate debts, and all the states ratify the 13th Amendment, the 13th Amendment being that which brings an end to slavery. But the radical Republicans, again, I take exception to that term, on some regards, okay, think that Johnson is still being too lenient to the South. And so Johnson vetoes the congressional passed Civil Rights Act, which would have moved much of Reconstruction into Congress's hands. And for the first time ever, we're actually going to see Congress is going to override a presidential veto. So Andrew Johnson was in favor of the 13th Amendment, which brought an end to slavery, but was against any further steps to provide former slaves and Black Americans with any other civil rights. He was in favor of these black codes, which is essentially, as we said, just a series of laws. I think the first state to pass some black codes was Mississippi, and all of the other former Confederate states followed in short order, saying that essentially that outside of not being a slave, that Black Americans had no other rights beyond just not being a slave, right? That they still couldn't vote. They still couldn't own property. They were relegated to serving primarily as sharecroppers or tenant farmers, or then get out of the South. Johnson, it's recognized, is he's racist. He was a former slaveholder, and he's from Tennessee. He was a Southern Democrat. He was against secession, but he wasn't really against any of the other leanings of the American South. And so Johnson is not willing to go nearly as far as maybe Abraham Lincoln would have gone, although Lincoln was going to be pretty lenient himself. At the end of the day, the veto of, or the override of Johnson's veto of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 brings about the era that we will call congressional Reconstruction, where now exactly how the South is both literally and figuratively rebuilt, that those powers belong no longer to the president, but to Congress. Congress had won kind of this power play here. In overriding Johnson's veto, they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that declares everyone who's born in the United States is a citizen, regardless of race or color or previous condition of servitude. They passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which doesn't recognize state governments formed under the Lincoln or Johnson plans. That, again, those quote unquote radical Republicans felt that both of those presidents, in fact, were too lenient on the South. They divide the South into military districts, and they send Northern troops to enforce these acts, as well as the congressional amendments that we'll talk about here in a second. Now, this obviously brings up a great amount of acrimony. The South views the Northern troops as occupational forces, right? That unwelcome, military rule over the South, which is essentially what it does amount to when we get to the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. But we might have an argument to make that perhaps that was necessary at the time. Very notably, Congress also passes a series of constitutional amendments during the era of congressional Reconstruction. We already talked about the 13th Amendment, which prohibits slavery, okay? Um, the 14th Amendment, which defines citizenship as all persons born or naturalized in the United States. Again, just like the Civil Rights Act of 1866, that gives citizenship to anyone in the United States, regardless of race or color of skin or whether or not they had formerly been a slave. And the 15th Amendment provides for Black men the right to vote, that one can't be prevented from voting based upon race, color, or again, previous condition of servitude. So these are what we call the Civil Rights Amendments. Now, they follow a very logical order, okay? Abolish slavery, define former slaves as citizen, and give Black, again, men, the right to vote. It's really important to understand here, right, that these are political but not economic in their nature. Okay, so there's nothing in here about curing the ails of the Southern economy in its dependence upon sharecropping and tenant farming, which I think we can define as de facto slavery, with the workers tied to the same land and the same plantation owners as were their original slaveholders. Okay, um, so there's nothing economic here. There's a series of kind of political but not economic successes in these Civil War amendments. On top of that, the South is able to circumvent the 15th Amendment. They can't pass a law that says Black people can't vote, okay? But they can disenfranchise the Black vote. They do this through a series of Black codes um, that establish a series of requirements for being able to vote. Okay. Uh, One is a literacy test that you can't vote unless you can prove your ability to read and to write. Now, mind you, during the era of slavery, it was illegal for a Black person to become literate, to learn how to read or write. And so by passing a literacy test, you're going to portray that you had also committed illegal acts. Beyond that, very few Black Americans, from a big picture perspective, could pass a literacy test, seeing as how they had no access to any sense of widespread education. They also passed a poll tax saying, okay, so if you want to vote, you have to pay a fee essentially to vote. Well, you can imagine if we are dealing with an economy that is engineered to disfavor the Black American, the sharecropping and the tenant farming systems. Well, Black Americans have no money to pay that poll tax. Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting, right? So there are a lot of white Americans in the South who are both illiterate and also cannot afford to pay a poll tax, that are not plantation holders. They are, what might be described, we talked about this before, as kind of the poor white trash, right? So one of the aspects here of circumventing the 15th Amendment through a Black code is what's called the grandfather clause. Now, you may have heard this term in vernacular language. It's still a term that's used today, right? To say that you're able, I'll give an example that when I was teaching in North Carolina public schools, I was paid at a higher rate because I have a master's degree in education. Now, North Carolina passed legislation against paying more for a master's degree. But because they passed that legislation after I had already secured my master's degree and was getting paid at that rate, okay, I was grandfathered in to this previous law. Okay, that makes sense. The grandfather clause essentially says then that you can still vote even if you are illiterate or can't afford to pay a poll tax, as long as your grandfather had been eligible to vote. Well, no Black Americans, none of these freedmen, former slaves, would have had a grandfather who had been able to vote. But the poor white trash, as it were, had grandfathers that had been able to vote, of course. Okay. And so the grandfather clause comes about to very cleverly allow the white vote to exceed the black vote. This is how the black codes make this era of Republican rule during early Reconstruction short lived without ever mentioning race and therefore violating the 15th Amendment in technical terms. These pieces of legislation throughout the former Confederate states served to successfully disenfranchise Black Americans from the political process. It is nefarious, but certainly clever and certainly effective. So I want us to get into in our next class what we're going to talk about, kind of the end of the Reconstruction era. We're going to talk about the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, I think, a little bit. It's a lot to get bogged down on, so I haven't quite made up my mind on that. But we are going to get into that military redistricting and what we would call the period of hard Reconstruction led by President Ulysses S. Grant. And then we're going to get into the Compromise of 1877. And the election of, in doing so, the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, and effectively the end of Reconstruction in the South. So as we study Reconstruction and then, as I said, the end of Reconstruction this week, I've got kind of three pieces of homework for you, okay? One is a crash course ed puzzle assignment that should be posted by now to your Google Classroom. One is a actively learn assignment that has to do again with Reconstruction. That should also by now be posted to your Google Classroom. I need you to get both of those assignments, the Ed Puzzle and the Nat Geo, done before Monday of next week. I also need you to get all of these terms into your class notes. These are a series of the most important terms that you're going to need to understand in order to sound smart and talk about Reconstruction and the end of Reconstruction post-Civil War in the United States. Okay, so you got a series of terms you need to know. You've got an ed puzzle. You've got an actively learn. A lot of those questions go back to these series of terms. Again, this is due before Monday of next week, so I would suggest you go ahead and get started on it. That's all I got for you today. Thanks, guys.